Let the scriptures speak for themselves.
So, I'd love to hear the your thoughts on the second coming of Christ, and maybe comparing. Maybe this is 10,000 questions. I don't know, but the second coming of Christ, or maybe the culmination of Christ in history, and when Jesus said here in these passages we've looked at, Mark 13, Mark 14, that he was going to come on the clouds. I think it's clear biblically in our Old Testament what he meant by that. But David, is this to be confused with other things said in the New Testament of the world coming to an end, or of Christ, closing out history, right? Maybe the full preterist view, right? If that's even what that is, I don't know. So could you help us maybe tease out like what this is that happened in 70 AD, and then the first resurrection, second resurrection? I don't know if that's a good question or if that even makes any sense, but.
No, I think so. So, I took most of my notes here on the first and second resurrections to talk about that. I think as far as Christ's coming in 70 AD, this was definitely a pivotal moment.
Yeah.
The reason I think it's pivotal is now I think I understand it to be a little different than I did before. But I think the reason it's pivotal is because of the kingdom, right? The kingdom was established.
Yeah.
And of all the other things that Christ did, yes, he atoned for our sin. Yes, he rescued the righteous out of Hades. Yes, he did all these different things. He put down the nations.
Yeah.
He gained all authority. And that was all about the kingdom. And we are part of that. And so to me, that is the thing that happened and that we need to be so aware of. And in regards to these resurrections, like, Revelation 20 is where it talks about this first resurrection.
Mm.
And so, again, to me, this is what the Jews had been talking about and batting around in their rabbinical texts for centuries. And so they expected the righteous from Adam forward, who had died and were essentially resting in Hades, waiting for this Redeemer that actually in a lot of ancient texts, God gives the prophecy that this Redeemer was going to come rescue them out of Hades. So this is what the Jews had been talking about for a very long time, the resurrection.
And can I
yeah.
insert something? Hades, for our listeners, is Hades, we might hear that and think eternal hell, damnation, but Hades in the Old Testament would have been more like Sheol, like a holding place for dead people, not necessarily a place of torment and punishment. Is that right? Is that how you'd understand it?
I believe that's true. And I see Sheol and Hades as just Hebrew and Greek equivalents of the exact same thing.
Me too. Yeah. Okay, cool.
And so, I call it the underworld.
Yeah.
And
the holding place
lack of a better term,
dead people.
Well, and there's a lot of places there. There's if you've read the book of Enoch, there's lots of divisions and different parts for different things, and angel prisons and Tartarus and all sorts of stuff. Okay. But there is a landscape, like a spiritual landscape like that. And it's, so it's very prolific. But in Revelation 20, we see this mentioned, and this is this is a hard passage. I'm just going to leave that on the table too. This passage is not easy. Revelation 20 is not easy.
Yeah.
But there is something that as I really studied through this thing, and I've read the book of Revelation, I don't know how many, like probably 24 times at least straight through.
Sure.
And then of course on studies like this, you deep dive into little parts here and again, there and again. But in verse 5, it says, but the rest of the dead, and this is after the 1,000 years, it says the rest of the dead live not again until the 1,000 years were finished. This is the first resurrection. Now, the problem is we need to remember that in Greek, because I have gone to the earliest manuscripts we have of this, the codices and different. In the Greek, it's all lowercase. There's no word divisions. There's no verse divisions. There's no chapter divisions. It's one long text, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And what is, I think, our problem here that trips us up every time is that this verse 5 in chapter 20 of Revelation, the sentence, "This is the first resurrection," was meant as a kind of encapsulation of everything it had just talked about. Everything it had just talked about was that the saints were raised.
Yeah, verse 1 through 4, right?
Yep,
Yeah,
they were
and
raised and put on thrones. And it talks about all the other stuff that happens during that time, the 1,000 years and Satan bound and everything. And then it says this was the first resurrection, essentially.
Yeah.
Everything I just described to you, that's the first resurrection. And that's about the saints who had been waiting in Hades and were resurrected before the millennium started. And so with that understanding, it makes a lot more sense. Okay. Because when I first read this, I thought, well, there already was a resurrection in verse 1 or whatever, you know. But what it's talking about is kind of an encapsulation, an outline saying that thing I just told you all about, even though it spanned 1,000, I was talking about that first resurrection.
Yeah.
And so then it says, "Blessed and holy is he that has part in that first resurrection, because on such the second death," meaning the lake of fire, "has no power." Those people that were resurrected to start the kingdom, they will never see the lake of fire, obviously, right? And so that makes 100% sense. So now we've identified that first resurrection. And then when we talk about a second resurrection, to be honest, like I've searched a lot of text and never do I see a second resurrection mentioned that way in that phrasing. Cool. So I do believe that quote, first resurrection was the resurrection, like I said, that the Jews had been looking for, that it had been prophesied. But if there is a second resurrection, it could possibly be how in Revelation 25, it says, "But the rest of the dead live not again until the 1,000 years were finished." Perhaps that was a second-ish resurrection. But I honestly, on that verse, I'm just a little foggy, so I'm not going to say I know. But to be honest, that's all I know of a possible second resurrection, other than the fact that a Christian at his death will be taken up to be with those who are in heaven. Yeah. And if you want to call that a resurrection, but that would be a personal one, not a corporate. So gotcha. That's where I go on that. I don't know how you see it, but
I don't know how I see it, man.
It's a hard one. It's a hard passage. It really is.
Yeah. So let's think about this in timetables. I'd love to get your thoughts on that. I'm really, like I said, I have no idea. I can tell you what the Olivet Discourse means, but this is something else. But so with Jesus's resurrection, we have 3 days later, he's physically, bodily, and in a new type of body, but still physical, resurrected. After 3 days, there's a weird ending in Matthew that records other saints being resurrected from the dead. And then there's this other passage in 2 Peter that records Jesus descending into, is it Hades? The underworld to preach to the ones that were condemned, the dead ones, to preach. And then he is raised back up. It says the ones that he went to go preach to were from the days of Noah. We could go 1,000 ways, but help me and help our listeners understand your view on understanding these in regards to the resurrection, and then what you just went over in Revelation 20, verse 1 through 5. Like, give us a timetable and some labels does that make sense, to properly understand these things that happen? And I, whether you to the best of your ability, because this is sticky.
Thinking now, and this just goes to show that this is all complicated, and that I think I just got something wrong. But so I believe that when Jesus did die on the cross, and most people, I would say the majority of Christians, don't understand this. It's mentioned in the Bible, but it's mentioned very briefly, and that is that he did go to Hades. Yeah. And that he did something there. That's about all the Bible really talks about. Right. It just doesn't go into detail. Yeah. And so, but Jesus did, and there's a lot of writings that attest to this, including early Christians who were right after this time period. They wrote about it. So we know that that's what they thought happened, right? Yeah. So he went there, and the way I understand it is that at the time he died and went down to Hades in those 3 days, he did come out with the righteous that were there, from Adam to Abraham to everyone that had died that was righteous
Yeah.
before he came.
Yeah.
And they were taken to paradise, which is the Garden of Eden, by the way, as far as the texts speak. Now, then what we just talked about in Revelation 20 was actually at the time of his coming in 70 AD. And why was it? Because who is it in chapter 20 that is resurrected? It's the saints, it's the martyrs.
Mm-hmm.
It's the ones who get the white robes for being martyred for the blood, for their testimony of Christ during the tribulation period, the 40 years essentially, and then that last 3.5 that was Crazy Town. They were martyred for it. So this is the, I think I'm going to say it right in saying this is the first fruits of the kingdom, but they are the first ones to be resurrected and made on kings on thrones, essentially to rule in the kingdom for 1,000 years during the millennium. And there's a lot of texts in Revelation that speak about this and these people, but these martyrs were special. They were special because they had to go through this time period.
Right.
And so there was the resurrection of the righteous dead out of Hades when Christ went down there, and he went to heaven for the 40 years. There were a lot of martyrs martyred. A lot of Christians died for their beliefs, a lot of Jewish Christians and Gentiles. And then at the end of that, that's the start of the kingdom for realsies. And he takes them who had been martyred because of their sacrifice, and they were purified by that. Is I think how it talks about it in Revelation. They were taken to be the first part of that kingdom, set on thrones, given white robes, and they stood in judgment over wicked Israel and the others that it talks about multiple times in the Gospels. Jesus says they will rise up and judge you, right?
Yeah, that's right.
That's what it's talking about.
Yeah.
So that's my view on that, really.
Gotcha. Yeah, I can't say whether, I agree or disagree. I have no idea, but no,
There
that's
it
helpful.
is.
Yeah. Yeah.
It would take a long time to exegete that.
Yeah.
So
No. I completely agree. Yeah. I just wanted to hear, your thoughts, and, no, that's super helpful. I think, sometimes, if we project too much into the future or we misalign things, we end up having to create additional beliefs to reconcile with what the text is actually saying, or we try to create dual fulfillments where there isn't, or we try to make up fulfillment. I don't know. It goes all over the place. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that passage. No, it's really helpful.
Good.
Yeah. Thanks, David.